Responsibilities and limitations of electrical workers. Hello everyone. Today's topic is about, as I just said, responsibilities and limitations of electrical workers. What does that mean to us? Why are we talking about this today? So for you in particular, it means that as an apprentice, as a future trainee, there are going to be a number of limitations on the work that you can do as a trainee. And even when you become qualified, there are a number of things that you can and can't do. So it's really important at this very early stage in our journey for us to have some understanding of what we are and are not allowed to do. Things like prescribed electrical work, which we've briefly covered before, which is the type of work only a qualified electrician can do. What does prescribed electrical work mean? What kind of work is included under that? Who's allowed to do it? Supervision, again, we've covered that briefly before. What constitutes supervision? Who's allowed to supervise? Who are they allowed to supervise? All of those kind of things fall under our limitations. And then responsibilities has to do with, I guess, mainly certification of the work that we do. So what is it that we have to do in relation to the work? So let's crack into it. Supervision of trainees. Supervision of trainees who are holding a limited certificate. Section 74 of the Electricity Act 1992, that's our act, restricts who can carry out prescribed electrical work as defined by the act to those persons who are registered and hold a current license or who are operating under an employer license. So that means if we're going to go and do prescribed electrical work, we must have the appropriate license for the work that we're going to do. In order for us to understand this clause, we need to know what prescribed electrical work is. We'll get into that in a bit, but very shortly, that's essentially means that any type of installation work at low voltages up to 1000 volts. It also references a employer license here. Employer license. An employer license is where a company may hold a special license to do electrical work and have their employees do electrical work, and when those employees aren't otherwise qualified. It doesn't just mean that they can ask anyone to do their work. It generally means that they have a training regime of their own, which is seen as equivalent to a normal electrical apprenticeship. I don't know of any companies currently that have employer licenses like this. I believe it's quite an old school idea. I may be wrong on that. But the advantages of having an employer license and training people under an employer license versus actually having them qualified are not really... There's no real value in that, so I don't think that's really used anymore, although I can't tell you that for sure. Nevertheless, that's not something that we need to generally worry about. Okay, section 77. All right, so we just looked at section 74. Section 77 says a person may do or assist in doing any prescribed electrical work if that work is within the limits prescribed in regulations made for the purposes of this section, and the person is a trainee in relation to the work, and the work done by that person is carried out in accordance with a limited certificate issued by the board to the trainee under section 78. So that's saying that we're allowed to do electrical work or help with electrical work if we are a trainee and we have a limited certificate issued to the trainee. That's you. So that tells us there's some sort of license or certificate that we need to hold as trainees in order to be able to do any prescribed work or assist in doing prescribed work. Now, this is an interesting one because back when I was an apprentice, and bear in mind when I was an apprentice, I certainly wasn't an expert on electrical law, but my understanding or my recollection from that time is that there was no requirement for anybody who was assisting doing prescribed electrical work to hold any certification or qualification whatsoever. Certainly when I was an apprentice, I did not hold a limited license or limited certificate. There was no such thing. So that meant anyone, as long as you were working with someone who was licensed to do that work, anyone could assist doing that work. Now that's been changed, as I understand it, because an acknowledgement of the risk that comes with even being supervised. If you don't have any understanding of the hazards and dangers that you're facing, then obviously even assisting in electrical work can be quite dangerous. So the minimum standard for someone to have that kind of limited license is only really first aid, safe working practices. In fact, I believe that once you finish this course, you would satisfy all the requirements to be issued a limited license. So it really is not saying much in terms of that person's competence to do electrical work. It's very much a minimum standard. So continuing on Section 77 of the Act, a definition of a trainee means a person who's undergoing instruction or training in any class of prescribed electrical work for the purpose of obtaining registration as a registered person. So this really strongly refers to an apprentice. You might look at that section and think that that covers us as students, someone undergoing instruction in any class of prescribed electrical work, but there's two reasons why this doesn't apply to us. And one is that the work that we do at the Tech is not considered prescribed electrical work. We're not doing any sort of actual installation. Everything that we do would fall under the category of experiment, I suppose. And also we're not doing this for the purposes of obtaining registration. Nothing that we're doing now is leading us to registration. You are not apprentices yet. So although this will contribute to your future registration once you become an apprentice, we're not working towards that yet. I hope that makes sense. So B there, it says and includes an apprentice who's working in the electricity industry. So it's a really clear definition there that a trainee and an apprentice are the same thing for the purposes of these sections. This section does not prevent a trainee from doing or assisting in doing work under 76, which allows work to be done under supervision. So we're allowed to do electrical work under supervision if we are a trainee who has a trainee license. Limits of work that trainees may do. For the purpose of Section 77, 1A that we just looked at, the prescribed electrical work that a trainee may do or assist in doing is any work that is within the particular class of work for which that trainee is seeking registration, and that is within the scope of the work that the trainee's supervisor is authorised to do. Right, so there's a couple of things that we need to unpick out of there. It talks about the class of work that you're seeking registration. So that depends on what kind of trainee you are. Obviously, we're all working towards, or our long-term goal is registration as an electrician, but there are other types of electrical worker who are registered. We may have mentioned these before, electrical appliance service technician and an electrical service technician. So if you're a registered trainee in one of those disciplines or one of those classes of electrical worker, then you can only do the work that those people would be authorised to do. So generally that's working on appliances or electrical equipment. The main distinction between an electrician and a service person is that service persons are not allowed to do any installation. So they're not allowed to install new cabling, new sockets, light switches, light circuits, anything like that, switchboards, nothing like that. They generally only work on things that are plug-in appliances or equipment. So that means that someone who is a trainee electrical service person would not be allowed to do the type of prescribed electrical work that an electrician would do, even if they were being supervised by an electrician. They're only allowed to do the work that falls under the type of registration that they're training towards. And then the second part there, it has to be within the scope of work that trainee supervisor is authorised to do. So that's the opposite thing then. If you're a trainee electrician, you're allowed to do the same prescribed electrical work that an electrician would do when you're supervised, but you must be supervised by someone who is authorised to do that work. So even though you're an apprentice electrician, for example, if you are working with an electrical service person for the day, you wouldn't be allowed to do any prescribed electrical work that an electrician would do, because the person supervising you is not authorised to do that. But it's pretty good common sense, right? You're only allowed to do the work in the particular class that you are working under, and you're only allowed to do the work that the person who's supervising you would also be allowed to do. That makes sense. Definition of supervision, right? So we've talked about this a little bit before. What does supervision mean? It talks, our legislation talks a lot about supervision, and in relation to us as future trainees, it's really, really important that we understand what the definition of supervision is, or how that relates to us, because not only does it talk about the things that you're allowed to do, so or not allowed to do, so your limitations, it's also important to understand what we can expect from our supervisors. So an example would be if you were on your first days of an electrical apprenticeship, and the boss, the supervisor, asked you to go to a work site by yourself and start doing electrical work there, and they would say, "Oh, I will supervise you over the phone. Ring me if you need anything." We need to know, is that legal? Do I have to do this? So a little bit around what the responsibility to us from the supervisor is. So this is Electricity Act Section 2, Supervision, Section 2 of the Electricity Act. Again, I believe that's definitions. So this is just giving us what it says for supervision under the definitions in the Electricity Act. As ever, I encourage you to please go and find this stuff yourself. There's links to the Electricity Act, of course, in Canvas, so or you can just find it online. So go and have a look at yourself and see what you can figure out. But here's what it says. Supervision in relation to any work means that the work is undertaken under such control and direction of a person authorised under this Act to do the work, or in the case of Section 76, a person authorised to supervise work under that section, as is sufficient to ensure that the work is performed competently, and that while the work is being undertaken, appropriate safety measures are adopted, and that the completed work complies with the requirements of any regulations made under Section 169 of this Act. So 3 things there. Someone needs to supervise you in a way that they know that the work will be performed competently, that you're doing it correctly, and that you are doing it safely, and that when you're finished, it's compliant. Now, that's still a pretty broad definition, right? It doesn't say, well, you can do this sort of work when you're a first-year apprentice, and this person has to stand next to you and watch everything you do, or they have to be in the same room, or the same building, or use supervision over the phone. So that means that there is a fair amount of scope here, and that's generally discretionary scope for the supervisor to be able to decide what type of supervision is appropriate for you. We have discussed before that perhaps the supervision required for a first-year apprentice wouldn't necessarily be the same as the supervision required for a fourth-year apprentice who's, all they need to do is their final exam before they get qualified, for example. So there's a bit of discretion in there. We're not just going to say, well, all apprentices have to be supervised like this. We acknowledge that, different apprentices' abilities are going to be very different, and therefore the supervision requirements are going to be very different. However, the supervisor would have to justify under this clause here that they are supervising in a way that ensures all of these 3 requirements are met. So the limits of work, or limits of prescribed electrical work for trainees. Remember that prescribed electrical work, again, that's only work that qualified electricians can do. So for the purposes of Section 77, which we looked at earlier, this prescribed electrical work that a trainee may do or assist in doing is any work that is within the particular class of work for which the trainee is seeking registration, and that is within the scope of work that a trainee's supervisor is authorised to do. We've already covered this section. It's just reiterating that there. So what work must be supervised? It is a condition of all limited certificates issued by the board that all prescribed electrical work completed by a trainee must be supervised by a supervisor. Well, that sounds pretty self-explanatory, right? Yeah, it is pretty self-explanatory. Again, just remembering that a limited certificate, when you become an apprentice, you apply for a limited certificate, you must have safety training, first aid, CPR. As I said, everything to get that would be covered in this course. So once you have that limited certificate, you can do prescribed electrical work, but you must be supervised by a supervisor. It's pretty straightforward. So supervision. The Electricity Act restricts who can carry out prescribed electrical work to those persons who are registered and hold a current license. We saw that one as well. So only people qualified and licensed are allowed to do a prescribed electrical work. So what does that mean? A person, the supervised person or a trainee, may do any prescribed electrical work or assist in doing any prescribed electrical work if that work is within the limits prescribed in regulations made for the purposes of this section. The work done by the supervised person is carried out under the supervision of a registered person who holds a current practicing license issued under this Act that authorises the person to supervise electrical work, and except as provided in any regulations, while that work is being carried out by the supervised person, no part of the work is connected to a power supply, and the work is tested and certified in accordance with the regulations connected to a power supply by a registered person who holds a current practicing license issued under this Act that authorises the person to supervise electrical work. Okay, so most of that section there is stuff that we've already covered. It just says that you have to be supervised by someone who's qualified, so on and so forth. There's a couple of interesting additions in this particular clause that are of interest to us. So C, while the work is being carried out by the supervised person, no part of the work is connected to a power supply. So as an electrician, you have some discretionary power to do work on live circuits, should you wish to do so. You know, the risk assessments and that kind of thing would play a part here, but you are allowed technically to do that if you need to. What this says is that a trainee is not allowed to do that work. So a trainee must not work on anything that is live. And following that, we have to test and certify the work. That's fine. But the last part there, D2, at the bottom here says it's connected to a power supply by a registered person. So that means the work that you're doing must not be live. And then when you've finished it, the person who connects it and makes it live must be the supervisor. Or presumably another registered person. If there were more than one, your supervisor might not be the only electrician on site, I suppose. But I guess in most cases it should be your direct supervisor because it's your work. They're supervising you, they should be the one signing it off, and therefore they should be the one that's connecting it. For the purposes of section 76, the prescribed electrical work that a person may do, or that a person who is under supervision may do or assist in doing, is any work within the scope of that work that the person's supervisor is also authorised to do, except that a person under supervision may not connect or disconnect a supply of electricity to works or to an installation or appliance. So you're not allowed to connect or disconnect. Somebody else has to do that for you. You must not do any certification or inspection of works, installations, fittings, or appliance. Again, somebody else has to do that. That makes sense, right? Because that means I will do the work. I'm a trainee, I do the work, and then my supervisor comes in afterwards and they do the inspection and certification, which is exactly as it should be, that they've got to check what I've done, and then they are the one who connects that and make it live. Despite section 76C of the Act, the supervised person may test works, installations, fittings, or appliance that are connected to a power supply, provided there is no direct access to live parts at a voltage above extra low voltage. So that means, although we said earlier that you're not allowed to do any live work, you can still do testing on something that's live, as long as you're not able to touch anything that's live. An example would be, and this is something we've already done, putting your multimeter into a socket outlet. that doesn't count as live work that a trainee is not allowed to do. Limited licenses. Different circumstances could lead you to apply for a limited certificate. As I said before, the limited certificate is something that we need as a trainee to do electrical work under a supervisor. So if you're working towards obtaining an electrical registration and need extra work experience for your registration assessment, if you wish to assist with carrying out all prescribed electrical work that your supervisor is entitled to do, limited certificates can be held by trainees or those completing registration requirements, including overseas trained electrical workers applying for registration in New Zealand. So what we're saying here is that there's two types of people who might have a limited license. One is us, trainees. When we become apprentices, we get a limited license. That makes sense. The second one is if somebody's coming from overseas and wishes to be an electrician in New Zealand, if they've been previously trained or registered somewhere else in the world, the process for those people is that they would apply to the board in New Zealand, the EWRB, and provide evidence of their previous certifications, experience and qualifications, presumably in other countries. The EWRB would then make an assessment on that. Now, we've talked earlier about, or previously about, say, someone coming from Australia, because we use all the same standards and so forth. If they're current and up to date with all their safety training and all their exams and everything in Australia, then it's highly likely that they would be just given registration in New Zealand. They make that application, pay a fee, and they can become registered people in New Zealand. I'm not saying that's 100% true, by the way. That makes sense to me. I believe that's how it works. If you're coming from further away, say England would be a good example. England uses the same voltage as us, and most of their rules and requirements are substantially similar to ours. Their electrical system mostly is the same as ours, but not quite as close as Australia would be. So that person coming from England, they might have some additional requirements, such as they might have to do just the New Zealand regulations exam, just to prove that they understand the differences between what their previous experiences and the laws and rules in New Zealand. But the board might say, yeah, your practical experience is fine, we just need you to do the exam on New Zealand legislation. That makes sense. Again, if you go further afield and the more dissimilar your experience is from New Zealand experience, the more they're going to ask you to do. And in some cases, they will ask people to complete a period of practical training under a supervisor. And if that's the case, then those people would be issued a limited license. Trainee cards. You must be a board-approved trainee for your experience to be acknowledged towards registration and hold a limited certificate trainee card. So any work that we do, when we go out on and get an apprenticeship and we're doing work, that work is part of our apprenticeship, right? It counts towards our qualification. We get our competency signed off. You must have a limited license for that for that experience to count. If you were coming from overseas and the board said, you need to get some experience under your belt in New Zealand under a supervisor, you can't then turn around and go, I've already been working for an electrician for a year, because they're going to say, no, you didn't have a limited certificate, it doesn't count. The card is issued with the obligation to complete the directed coursework and examinations during its currency. So there will be a period on that license that it expires in. I think it's 4 years. I could be wrong, but I think it's 4 years. So the idea is that you complete your apprenticeship within the 4 years. In saying that, if you can apply to the board for an extension should you need it. I mean, if you, for example, fail your exam, but you're still working towards it and you're going to take the exam later and it's going to take over the period of your license, your limited license, then they'll probably allow you to extend that time. I was talking to Monica the other day and she mentioned a couple of cases where people's limited licenses the extensions were declined because they couldn't demonstrate that they were actually making any progress towards their qualification. They were essentially accepted that they're going to be apprentices forever, and the board doesn't want you to do that. They want people to actually complete their training. The applicant will be advised of the required coursework and examination aspects at the time of issue. So again, that's probably mostly towards people who are coming from overseas. So they'll be told, here are the things that you need to do to complete your registration, get a license as a full electrician. The requirements for obtaining a trainee limited certificate. Your employer supports your application and completes the relevant section of the application form, agreeing to supervise you in accordance with board rules. So this means that someone will most likely be your direct boss, but somebody who is registered as an electrician, licensed as an electrician, has to nominate themselves and agree to be your supervisor. That puts a level of responsibility on them, and it allows, I guess, the board to have somebody that they know is responsible for you. They're not just going to issue you a trainee limited certificate. You say, oh, I've done the training, I've got my first aid and all of that kind of stuff. Can I have a limited license, please? Oh, well, actually, you need an employer or somebody who's going to be your supervisor, and then it's going to issue it to you so you can run around in the world and work for whatever electrician you want. Your tuition and safe working practices and testing. CPR and basic first aid is completed within 3 months of issuing the trainee limited certificate. So that would mean that they could issue a limited certificate when you start as an apprentice, but you have to do that training within 3 months of getting that certificate. As I said earlier, those are all the things that we cover. We cover all of those things in this course. In fact, we were booked to do our first aid. Well, as I'm creating this video, it would be next week, which is if you're watching this video in the week that we're completing this, it would have been this week. If we're in lockdown as you watch this, then I don't know. We'll do it when we get back to class. Maybe next week, maybe 6 months from now, might be never. Could be in lockdown for the rest of our lives because the government is taking over and it's a dictatorship now. I don't know. If that's happened, probably we won't have access to YouTube, so you won't be watching this anyway. Just to clarify, because I saw something weird in the news this morning, I'm not expressing an opinion that I think the government is trying to take over the country by putting us on lockdown. That was a joke. Actually, since I've mentioned it, a little digression. And I apologise, you could probably skip forward a minute or two if you want to skip this. Obviously, when we're in class, I digress quite a lot, tell stories and yada yada, just because it's interesting. A little less so in the YouTube videos because there's no feedback, there's no people sitting there that I'm talking to, it's just a screen. But the thing I saw in the news this morning was that a Polytech tutor in Southland one of their students had gone to the media, I guess, saying that they had been talking about conspiracy theories in class and telling them that Jacinda Ardern and Bill Gates are trying to take over the world with COVID, something like that. I'm not really sure. I thought it was interesting because then I thought, oh man, I tell some pretty wacky stories in class sometimes. I hope none of my students go to the media and talk about that. But I thought, I don't think I've ever said anything that's as crazy as that. And certainly I try when I can, if I am saying something that is my opinion and not a fact, I try to point that out. That this is my opinion. I'm not presenting this as a fact, which I think is an important distinction. Where you can believe my opinion or not, you can choose to accept it as a fact. That's your choice. But when I present an opinion to you, I want to make clear that it is my opinion, and you don't have to believe me. You're not going to be tested on that in an exam or anything like that. I'd hate to think that we would get to the point where we'd ban people from expressing their opinions in that environment. I don't know. If you do ever feel like I've crossed the line in that regard and I'm giving too much of my own view or presenting things that are opinions as facts, please let me know. Please let me know, because I'd hate to think that I'm doing it. Anyway, let's move on. Right, a limited certificate is mostly issued to those who gain experience overseas. That's how, as we discussed before. A limited certificate enables you to work while you complete any requirements, such as certain examinations or work experience, as we discussed, for your registration as an electrical worker. You must provide a statement from the registered and licensed person who will supervise you as you carry out prescribed electrical work. Same thing again, that you have to have somebody who's essentially sponsoring you, I guess. If you are completing exams after an assessment of overseas qualifications and experience, your limited certificate will last 1 year. So they'll give you a limited certificate for 1 year so that you can complete that work. If you are completing work experience, your limited certificate will last for the time required to satisfy the registration requirement. So if you just need to do the exams only, if the EWRB says you only have to do the exams and you don't have to do any practical work experience, then it will be 1 year. If they need work experience from you, it'll be for a longer time. Again, this is interesting information. It's important to know, but please be aware that this doesn't really apply to us, so we're not coming from overseas. And let's just look here and go back to the previous slide. So this is talking about a limited certificate, and then we've got a trainee limited certificate. So trainee limited certificate is the one that specifically applies to us as apprentices, as trainees. The limited certificate is people who are coming from overseas. Limits of work and supervisors. The holder of a limited certificate may assist a supervisor in doing any prescribed electrical work that is relevant to the particular class of registration being sought. That entitlement is provided the electrical worker holds a current limited certificate and is supervised by the nominated supervisor whose practicing license allows that person to do the work. So same as what we were saying before, you're allowed to do prescribed electrical work as long as you're being supervised by somebody who's allowed to do that, and you have a limited certificate. You must have some sort of limited certificate. As I said, when I was an apprentice, that wasn't the case, but now it is. Okay, requirements for a person to be registered, licensed, or authorised. Electricity Act Section 86, minimum standards for registration. So, this allows people to be registered as electrical workers in a specific class. As I said, there's more than one, and in fact, small digression again, I believe that there is an effort underway by the board to change that to have more classes. So you might have people who are only allowed to do some electrician work, and then people who are allowed to do everything. So that might be in your time while you're an apprentice that the classes of registration change. Now, nevertheless, this applies for all classes, right? So what are the ways that we can be registered? A, by requiring a degree or diploma or certificate of a stated kind recognised by the board. B, by requiring the successful completion of a competence program, degree or course of studies accredited by the board. C, by requiring a pass in a specified examination or any other assessment set out by the board. D, by reference to registration with or a licence issued by an overseas organisation that performs current functions that correspond wholly or partly to those performed by the board. E, by requiring experience in the provision of services of a particular kind. F, by requiring a certain level of competence. Okay, so it's very, very broad, and we've talked before that the Electricity Act is not a document that goes into details, but it's basically saying that the board can specify a specific qualifications, degree, diploma or certificate, or training program of some kind. That's not something that they would just do on a case-by-case basis. That's something that they would say, well, you have to do this course, this course, this course, or this course, or if you have this degree, whatever. They can require examinations, and they do at the moment, and certainly as far as back as I know of, there's 2 examinations, electrical theory and electrical regulations. They can issue registration to somebody who has come from overseas, who has the right skills and experience. And they can also do it by experience or competence, so that would be an assessment on your particular skill level. The limits and restrictions that EWRB may impose. A person may not do any prescribed electrical work or assist in doing any prescribed electrical work unless that person is authorised to do so under this section. The following persons may do prescribed electrical work or assist in doing prescribed electrical work within the limits prescribed in regulations, if any. A registered person who is authorised to do or assist in doing the work under current practicing licence. A person who is authorised to do or assist in doing the work under a provisional licence. The person who is authorised to do or assist in doing the work under an employer licence. A person does not do any prescribed electrical work or assist in doing any prescribed electrical work in breach of this section if that work is done in accordance with any of sections 75 to 80. 75 to 80 we looked at before about trainee licenses and all that sort of stuff. Really, this is a long-winded way of saying you can't do any prescribed electrical work unless you're qualified and licensed to do it, which makes sense, right? There's nothing controversial there. Prescribed electrical work then, right, so we talked about this a lot, and you're going to hear these words out of my mouth probably 100 times in the coming year. What does it mean? Prescribed electrical work, PEW, PEW, is defined in Schedule 1 of the regulations. Work is classified in 3 risk-based categories. Low risk, high risk in general. Now, I think there was a video on the previous topic, electrical legislation, that talked about low, high risk, low, high and general risk. If you haven't watched that video, please go back and do it. If you look at this topic in Canvas, there are 3 videos in there that also talk around some of this stuff. Again, please go and watch those. It's really important that we try and get as much information as possible, and it's not just from me, it's from those various sources as well. In fact, those particular videos on this stuff, the legislation stuff, are very, very good. They give a really clear and quite concise definition of certain things. So, low risk work comprises all maintenance or replacement prescribed electrical work. General work is work that's neither high risk or low risk. High risk work is work that is not low risk and includes, but is not limited to, mains work, installations operating at high voltage, installations located in hazardous areas or mines, and installations intended for use with medical devices. See Regulation 6A. So that's in the electrical safety regulations. Go and have a look at that one. Regulation 6A. It's going to talk about high risk work. Now, so what does this mean? That doesn't feel like it means very much at all, right? Low risk work is maintenance and replacement. High risk work is not low risk. General work is not high risk or low risk. It's very confusing. So I'll tell you. Low risk work, when it talks about maintenance or replacement, what that means is we're not installing anything new. So a replacement of an existing fitting with what we call like for like. So I'm replacing it with something of the same type and same function. It might not be the exact thing, right? I might replace an old socket with a new one, but that still counts as like for like. I don't have to have the identical socket that was there before. So replacement of something that's already existing is low risk. If I replace a socket, a light fitting, if I replace a light switch, if I replace even a fitting inside a switchboard, that's all low risk. High risk work, and now it talks about it there, mains work, high voltage, hazardous areas, and medical devices. That's pretty straightforward. Anything at high voltage, it's over 1,000 volts. Hazardous areas, so hazardous areas I've talked about before. That's my own personal background. That's petrol stations and stuff like that, right? Explosive atmospheres. Or in mines, that's straightforward. Or intended for use with medical devices. So anything in a hospital, right? If you're going to be plugging in medical devices, you know, the old beep, beep, beep machine that keeps people's hearts going, whatever, respiratory devices, anything medical, that counts as high risk work. Not because the work itself is high risk, but then the usage is going to be high risk. We can't afford to have any screw ups in electrical work on that kind of thing, because if it craps out, then someone might die. Yeah, not us this time, fortunately, but still, I don't want to kill anyone else either. General risk is everything else that doesn't fall into low risk or high risk. So that's, in most cases for us, that would cover the installation of new equipment or circuits in an existing installation. So it's running new cables, putting in new sockets, that kind of thing. Or building a new installation that isn't included in the high risk. So building a new installation that's not hazardous, mines, medical devices, so on and so forth. Now there is one thing here in the high risk work that would is mains work. So can I? Mains work. So that is generally anything to do with the mains cable in a installation or the main earth in an installation. It doesn't mean replacing anything that's connected to a mains cable. So I could still replace a circuit breaker or main switch that's connected to a mains cable. That doesn't necessarily mean it's high risk, but if I was installing a new mains cable or replacing a mains cable, main earth, anything like that, that becomes high risk. And what does this mean for us? Most importantly, I guess is the inspection side of it. So high risk work, any high risk work needs to be inspected by an electrical inspector. Low risk and general work, we as an electrician can certify that ourselves. We do our own work, we do our own certification. If you do high risk work, you require an electrical inspector, a separate person to come and look at that. Right, responsibilities of a person carrying out prescribed electrical work. Electrical Safety Regulation 13, doing work on works, installations, fittings and appliances. So any electrical stuff. A person who does work on any works or installation or on any part of any works or installation must ensure that the resulting works or installation or part of the works or installation is electrically safe, and if the work is on only part of any works or installation, that the work has not adversely affected the electrical safety of the rest of the works or installation. So that's pretty broad, right? What does it say? Any work that you do must be safe. And not only that, you also must ensure that any work that you did didn't make anything else unsafe. Electrical Safety Regulation 63, testing prescribed electrical work on low and extra low voltage installations. Low voltage, again, that's below 1000. Extra low voltage below 32. So that's usually alarm systems and that kind of thing. All prescribed electrical work done on low or extra low voltage installations or part installation must be tested for operational safety, like is it safe when it's operating, and to ensure that the installation or part installation is not electrically unsafe. So we need to do our electrical test to make sure that it's electrically safe, as required by Regulation 59 or 60 as the case requires. So there's a specific stuff that's contained within those two regulations. In the case of an installation or part installation that does not comply with Part 2 of AS/NZS 3000, in accordance with the verification or testing processes set out in the certified design for the installation or part installation. Right, so that last bit there is saying that if we do an installation that doesn't comply with Part 2 of AS/NZS 3000, we talked about that in the previous topic, what Part 1 and Part 2 meant, and again, just to be clear, we're almost always working under Part 2. It's very, very rare that we're going to come across work that we do under Part 1 only, or that does not comply with Part 2. This is saying that if we're not complying with Part 2, we have a certified design for that installation, and that certified design will contain procedures for the testing, verification and safety of that installation. So saying that if we have that verified design, then we have to do our testing in accordance with that design. Regulation 65. This is a really important one. We refer back to this often. A requirement for certificate of compliance. A certificate of compliance must be issued in accordance with these regulations for all general and high risk prescribed electrical work done on an installation or part installation that comprises the installation or maintenance of conductors used in the installation or part installation. So that's the cabling. The installation or maintenance of fittings. So that's the stuff that's screwed to the wall, anything in the switchboard, the sockets, light switches. A person who does low risk prescribed electrical work may, but is not obliged by these regulations to issue a certificate of compliance for that work. No general prescribed electrical work may be treated as complete until a certificate of compliance is issued for it. No high risk prescribed electrical work may be treated as complete until a certificate of compliance, along with any record of inspection required for the prescribed electrical work, is issued for it. Okay, so what else does this say? we don't have to do a certificate of compliance for low risk electrical work. So that was, remember, just a replacement like for fitting or a socket or something like that. So we don't need to do a certificate of compliance for that. It does say that I can do a certificate of compliance if I want. In some cases, that would be prudent, particularly if the customer wants something. You don't have to go into the details of why you would issue a certificate of compliance for this or that. If they want to say, oh, where's the piece of paper to certify it? Then I'll just write a certificate of compliance for them. It's fine. General work must have a certificate of compliance. And high risk work must have a certificate of compliance. And in addition, as I said earlier, the high risk work must also have a record of inspection. So it must be inspected and I must have a record of inspection. And it says there's some specific language here that we must have a look at, is that we cannot treat that work as complete until the certificate of compliance is issued for it. You can't just go, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. No, the work is not done until the paperwork is done. This is really, really important, and it's something that trips electricians up all the time, because we electricians and we do work and manipulate electrons and all of that cool stuff. And most of us find it boring and stupid to have to do a whole bunch of paperwork, especially if you're doing this kind of work all the time. There was a brief period that I was doing, I was installing heat pumps. And if you install a heat pump, you're going to run a new cable for that heat pump back to the switchboard usually, which means it was prescribed electrical work. It comes under general prescribed electrical work because I'm doing a new thing in that installation, installing something new, which means every time I installed a heat pump I had to write a certificate of compliance. The 6 months that I did that for, I think I've never written so many certificates of compliance in my life. It was outrageous. But there you go. I hated it, but you have to do it. Responsibilities of persons carrying out prescribed electrical work continued. So Electrical Safety Regulation 100 outlines the safety responsibilities of people who carry out electrical work. So a person who carries out any prescribed electrical work must, so far as reasonably practicable, there's that word again, reasonably practicable, all those two words. So that means anything that's within our power that's practical to do. So we must, before beginning the work, check that any associated equipment and personal protective equipment to be used by that person, us, is in good order and condition and is safe for its intended use. That means we check our PPE, we check our equipment. Follow the procedures approved by the employer for the work to be carried out. And again, we've talked about this before. That means that there is a legal requirement to follow the instructions, safety instructions given to us by our employer. So if there is a safety analysis or a safe work procedure given to us by the employer, we legally have to follow that. We must use the associated equipment and personal protective equipment, so our tools and equipment and our PPE provided in a competent manner. Don't put your hard hat on backwards. Don't be a dork. We must comply with Standard 4836, or the certified design for all electrical work carried out on electrical equipment operating at low or extra low voltage. So we have to follow the standards relevant to the work that we're doing. Person who may assist a registered electrician. Electricity Act 76, exemption for work done under supervision. A supervised person, may do any prescribed electrical work or assist in doing any prescribed electrical work if that work is within the limits prescribed in regulations made for the section, and the work done by the supervised person is carried out under the supervision of a registered person who holds a current practicing license issued under this Act, and that authorises the person to supervise electrical work. We've seen that one before. Electricity Act 77, again, this is reiterating something we've seen before. A trainee has an exemption in doing prescribed electrical work. If you are a trainee and you have a limited certificate, you're allowed to assist an electrician in doing work. Audit requirements of prescribed electrical work. Auditing is a function of the EWRB. So this year, I don't know when this was published, but I believe the pilot audit program was put into place around 2016, so perhaps that's when this was written. So this year we are undertaking a pilot audit program. The program will work to verify that licensed electrical workers are carrying out their work in a compliant, safe and competent manner. Yeah, okay, that's fairly vague. What does this mean for us? I might have talked about this before, but back in the day, in the old days when I was doing this sort of work regularly, you would buy a pad of certificates of compliance, and those would be numbered. The wholesaler I mean electrical supplier. The electrical supplier would write down who you were and your license number and the first and last number of the book of certificates that you bought. So if the EWRB wanted to do audits, they will randomly select a certificate number, find out who bought that certificate, and then come and find you and say, we want to review this work. We want to audit this work. It's never happened to me. A lot of the work I've done in the past has not required certificates of compliance, so I haven't filled out a lot in my work history. That's mainly because I've done mostly maintenance and repair type work as opposed to installation work. Nowadays you can fill out online certificates. That's fine. And if that happens, you can download a template and you can fill it out on an iPad or something like that. So the EWRB now have different methods of doing audits, and I believe that means contacting and dealing with individuals as opposed to following certificates themselves. Okay, electrical work requiring inspection. As we said before, high-risk work requires inspection, and in this case, inspection specifically refers to an electrical inspector, not an inspection by me. So, Electrical Safety Regulation 70, high-risk prescribed electrical work to be inspected. All high-risk prescribed electrical work done on low or extra-low voltage installation must be inspected as required by Regulation 59 or 60 as the case requires. Please go and have a look at those regulations. All high-risk prescribed electrical work done on a high-voltage installation must be inspected to verify that the installation complies with ECP 34 and Regulations 34, 41, 42, 43 and 44. So those that ECP and those regulations are specifically about high voltage. Most of us will never do that work. A person who inspects high-risk prescribed electrical work must undertake whatever tests, visual inspection or other actions are necessary to satisfy the person that the work has been done in accordance with these regulations, and the installation or part installation on which that work has been done will be, when enlivened, electrically safe. So it's really saying that we need a third party, another person, to come and look at our work if we do it on high risk, if we're doing high risk work, and that we must still fill out our own certificate of compliance certifying that we've done. They will fill out a record of inspection and give that to us to say that they've done that. Theoretically, I suppose that they're not going to do any type of test that we wouldn't already do, because we're always testing to make sure that everything is safe, right? But they have a higher level qualification, so you have to be, after you've been an electrician for some time, you can do an inspector's course and an inspector's exam and become qualified as an inspector, and this allows you to do inspections like this. They may do some additional stuff. So again, as an example, when I was working in fuel industry doing hazardous area inspections, any installations we did there had to have an inspection, and part of that inspection excuse me, would be that the inspector wanted to see the declaration of conformity for the equipment that we've installed. I mean, what that is not super important, but in short, it means that any equipment, such as a fuel pump, when you're going onto a fuel station and you lift up the nozzle, that pump has to be approved to be able to be used in that kind of environment, of course. And that means that all parts of it are sealed and explosion proof and all of this kind of stuff. So that piece of equipment will come with a declaration conformity to say that it meets those requirements, and very often, in fact every time I've had that done, the inspector wants to see that declaration of conformity. So they might do that in addition to normal testing that they do. But this is a backstop to make sure, for that particular high risk stuff, that somebody else is having a look at our work. ESR 71, who may carry out the inspection? Now, as I said before, it's going to be an electrical inspector. A person may inspect high-risk prescribed electrical work only if the person is authorised to inspect high-risk prescribed electrical work, or in the case of high-risk prescribed electrical work carried out under an employer licence, the person is authorised to inspect the work under the system of operation used by the employer. However, a person may not inspect prescribed electrical work if the person has personally carried out the work, or supervised someone else carrying out the work, or issued the certificate of compliance for the work. Right, so that means that in order to inspect high-risk work, we have to be an electrical inspector. But if I'm an inspector and I do some work myself, I can't also inspect that work. It has to be somebody else. It could be somebody from the same company, but it can't be the same person. We can't be the inspector, or the inspector can't do the inspection if they have supervised someone else carrying out the work. So they're just closing a loophole here, right? So we can't say, well, I didn't do the work, my apprentice did the work and then I inspected it. No, it still has to be somebody else. Or if you're the one issuing the certificate of compliance for the work. So maybe you didn't do the work. Maybe, again, if we're building a fuel station, we might have 3 or 4 electricians working on that. Now, I might be the one who issued the certificate of compliance for the whole job, for the whole service station that we built. But that doesn't mean I did all of the work, right? But I can't say, well, Steve did that work. I issued the certificate of compliance for the whole installation, but Steve did that work there, so I can do the inspection. No, if I'm the one issuing the certificate of compliance, I can't do the inspection. So, different types of compliance certificates, right? So, let's skip the first one. I'll come back to that. But certificate of compliance we talked about, that's required for general or high risk work, and we must do that. A record of inspection, that's what the inspector would do. So if I'm doing high risk work, I still fill out my own certificate of compliance, and the inspector will come along and do the record of inspection only for high risk work. Entry onto the EWRB, so that's the electricity and gas high risk database. I think that's what that stands for. So this kind of thing applies to people doing gas work as well. If we do a high risk work and we get an inspector to do a record of inspection, they have to upload that directly into the database. So that has to be recorded in that online database, there's a website for the EWRB database which you would upload that record of inspection to. Now let's go back to the start here. Electrical safety certificate. So this is something that has been introduced fairly recently, like probably in the last 5 or 6 years, I think. That is kind of a miniature version of certificate of compliance. Certificate of compliance, as I said, is required for general and high risk work. I've got to fill that out as the electrician responsible, and it contains a number of details about the work and the testing. Electrical safety certificate is a much shorter version of that, and it just says that I've done this work and it's safe. So it's required for general and high risk work in addition to the certificate of compliance. In most cases, it would be part of the same form. So we'll just fill out one form, and that will be my electrical safety certificate and certificate of compliance. Again, if you watch the videos from the videos for this topic, or perhaps the previous topic, I can't remember, there is actually a video that covers off the ESC and the COC. So the only difference then with the electrical safety certificate is for low risk work, I still have to do that. So that's that maintenance or replacement of like for like. I still have to do an ESC for that. And as I said, that's fairly new. So back in the day, you would do a COC for general or high risk work. You didn't have to do anything for low risk work, but now we're required to do electrical safety certificate. So that means all the work that we do must have some sort of certificate. And lastly, competency requirements and safety tuition. All registered electrical workers must hold a practicing license to carry out prescribed electrical work. This is a requirement of Section 98 of the Electricity Act. So let's just talk very quickly about the distinction between a practicing license and registration. when you apply to be registered with the EWRB and they accept your training and all of that sort of stuff, you know, you've done this exams and all the work required, you'll become registered. Your name goes on a list of registered electrical workers, and you remain registered forever. That never goes away. You will always be a registered electrician. A practicing license is something that has to be renewed every 2 years. And for a registered electrician to do electrical work, they must have a practicing license. So if you were working in the industry and you're registered and you have a practicing license, and then you go and work somewhere else where you're not doing electrical work, then you might not choose to renew your practicing license because you're not doing that kind of work. If you come back into the industry, you don't have to redo your registration. You'll always be registered, but you must obtain a new practicing license to do prescribed electrical work. To renew your practicing license, you must also have passed a board-approved competence program, which includes electrical safety and instruction in CPR and basic first aid. So this is a course that we go and do every 2 years, and it takes a day. You have to do prove that you can do basic testing, first aid, and CPR basically. And it's just to make sure that those very minimum safety requirements are maintained all the time, so that every electrical worker who is doing electrical work is able to prove competence in these things. A competence program is not an acceptable alternative to safety training for trainees, and it is aimed at refreshing prior knowledge. So what we're talking about there is that you may remember that we talked about the trainees have to do a course in those same things, electrical safety, CPR and first aid. You can't just go on to a competency refresher that an electrician would do every 2 years and then say, oh, that's my training. It's a little bit bigger than that. But again, this is all covered in our course. We're going to do first aid CPR, which is a 2-day course. It's delivered by somebody else, so we have a first aid CPR company coming to do that. I'm not going to teach you first aid and CPR, but the electrical safety stuff, certainly we will cover that off in the course. So you have to do that slightly bigger version rather than just the refresher. And that is that. Wow, we got there. Not too bad. How's it? Just on an hour. Pretty good. Hopefully we will keep these video lectures to around about that amount of time or less, because I know it's fairly draining for me to sit here and just talk to my computer like I'm pretending I'm talking to people, and I'm certain that it's quite difficult for you guys to sit here and just watch somebody talking for an hour. Anyway, that's it from me for now. No doubt I have issued you with instructions on what you need to do today, whatever day it happens to be that you're watching this. So please go and do that. Do the test for this topic. Anything else that we need to do. If we're in lockdown, stay safe. Give me a call if you need to. If you have any questions, please get in touch. Always happy to hear from you. Thank you very much, team. Have a happy day.